At one stage of construction, a steel truss span weighing thousands of tons hung beneath a giant floating crane over the Pingtan Strait. The load had to reach its supports, while vessels, rigging, wind, waves, and moving water all fought against precise alignment. Engineers reduced the time exposed offshore by prefabricating huge sections on land and waiting for workable weather windows. Tug crews, riggers, and survey teams guided each lift. But how did they reach this point? We have to rewind to the empty strait. Before the bridge existed, this route crossed open channels between islands exposed to wind, waves, tides, and marine traffic. The planned crossing stretched for more than 16 kilometers, turning one bridge project into a long offshore construction corridor. Survey vessels first mapped water depths, currents, navigation routes, and the seabed beneath every critical foundation position. Those measurements showed that the challenge was not simply distance. The construction site itself was constantly moving. Coastal winds frequently reached levels that could restrict cranes, survey work, concrete operations, and precise offshore lifting. Below the surface, strong currents moved around rock outcrops and temporary structures, complicating every fixed working position. Beneath that moving water, engineers also faced hard, irregular, and sometimes steeply sloping granite seabed. When severe coastal weather arrived, the safe response was not to fight it, but to secure the site and stop exposed operations. Weather and marine conditions were monitored continuously, so crews could identify windows when precision work could safely resume. Only when wind and sea conditions returned within workable limits could vessels, crews, and equipment move back into position. The bridge also had to carry two transport systems, a 6-lane highway above and a double-track railway below. Instead of two independent crossings, both levels were integrated into one deep structural steel truss system. Long approach structures carried most of the route, while cable-stayed bridges were reserved for major navigation channels. Offshore foundations therefore needed stable working platforms capable of holding heavy drilling equipment above moving water and hard granite. Another decision became equally important: fabricate as much steel as possible on land and reduce complicated work offshore. At the navigation spans, completed towers would support steel trusses, extending outward in carefully balanced cable-stayed cantilevers. The construction plan was now clear: stable foundations, controlled tower erection, large-scale land fabrication, and precision marine assembly. Foundation construction began by fixing the exact position of each marine support before heavy equipment entered the site. Temporary steel pipes were installed first, creating the supports needed to build a rigid offshore working platform. Heavy crossbeams then tied those temporary supports together, gradually forming a stable frame above the water. Smaller anchorage holes were drilled into the granite to secure this temporary system against marine forces. Grout and concrete locked those anchorages into the rock, strengthening the platform before permanent foundation drilling began. With the support frame enlarged, crews finally had a fixed offshore deck strong enough for the main drilling operation. The KTY 5000 hydraulic power head drilling system was then installed and aligned over the future pile position. A massive steel casing guided the permanent pile bore through the water and unstable upper material toward the rock below. Drilling continued deep into competent granite until the cylindrical foundation bore achieved the required rock socket. Crews then lowered an enormous cylindrical reinforcement cage into the completed bore, while keeping it precisely centered. Concrete entered through tremie pipes from the bottom upward, displacing drilling fluid without free-falling through the deep bore. After Typhoon Saudalor damaged a freshly drilled bore and casing, crews stabilized the disturbed zone with underwater grouting before re-drilling. Repeating the process created groups of rock-socketed piles, which were finally tied together by massive concrete pile caps. At the top of each cap, reinforcement and embedded steel prepared the exact interface for the permanent structure above. Final concrete completed the foundation block, transferring future bridge loads across the pile group and into the granite. Only after the cap was complete could the first permanent concrete pier begin to rise above the sea. Formwork, reinforcement, concrete placement, and survey checks repeated lift by lift as each marine pier gained height. Across the route, Fabrication Est, different foundations advanced at different rates, creating a long sequence of piers at staggered stages. At the navigation channels, much larger foundations carried the lower legs of the bridge's H-shaped concrete towers. Hydraulic climbing formwork moved upward in controlled cycles, protecting crews while each new tower lift was reinforced and cast. Near the top, the climbing system remained attached, while engineers continued checking geometry and vertical alignment. Eventually, each navigation bridge had a completed pair of towers standing across a channel that was still completely open. While foundations and towers advanced offshore, enormous quantities of structural steel were being prepared inside fabrication yards on land. Heavy plates and sections were cut and drilled to precise dimensions before they could become bridge members. Those pieces were welded into massive built-up members designed to carry forces through the deep road and rail truss. The most complex areas were three-dimensional nodes, where chords, diagonals, verticals, and transverse framing came together. Before larger assemblies continued, survey instruments checked dimensions so small fabrication errors could not accumulate across an entire span. Large panels were then combined into the broad three-dimensional truss, while major sections still remained intentionally incomplete. Piece by piece, the structure approached whole-span scale, with final connections still open for inspection and adjustment. Final welding, dimensional inspection, and protective coating prepared the completed truss for one of the project's most difficult operations. Hydraulic supports were positioned beneath the structure so its enormous weight could be transferred evenly for loadout. The completed span then began moving toward the quay at extremely low speed on synchronized heavy transport equipment. At the waterfront, the truss transferred onto engineered supports aboard a marine transport vessel without ever becoming unsupported. Heavy braces and restraints secured the load to the vessel before it was permitted to leave the quay. The loaded vessel then moved slowly through the strait, carrying the prefabricated span toward its offshore erection position. Beside Dachiao Hayo, tugboats positioned the transport vessel while crews connected and checked the giant crane's lifting system. With the span fully airborne, tugboats made small thrust corrections to control the position of the floating heavy lift system. The suspended truss approached its receiving pier slowly, with enough clearance remaining for controlled horizontal and vertical corrections. Survey teams then reduced that clearance to centimeters, aligning the enormous load directly above its permanent bearings. Only after alignment was confirmed did the truss settle onto the bearings and begin transferring its weight into the piers. Temporary connections secured the seated span while engineers verified its position and unloaded the crane rigging. At the navigation bridges, mainspan construction began differently, from short starter trusses attached beside the completed towers. The first major steel segments extended outward on both sides, so the tower was not subjected to uncontrolled imbalance. Repeating this process created early balanced cantilevers, still short compared with the wide channel they eventually had to cross. After a new steel segment was positioned, crews installed the stay cable that would help carry its weight back to the tower. Surveyors checked the cantilever again after tensioning, because every cable force adjustment affected the geometry of later segments. Another segment followed, then another cable, repeating the same controlled cycle as the structure reached farther over the water. By mid-construction, long cantilever arms and growing stay fans extended from the towers, but a large center gap remained. Engineers repeatedly measured tip elevation and cable forces, correcting small deviations before they could become major closure errors. With each balanced cycle, the opposing cantilevers moved closer, while the stay system carried their increasing weight back toward the towers. Eventually, only the final closure region remained open. But even then, the two structural ends could not simply be joined. Before closure, engineers had to bring the opposing tips into the correct elevation, alignment, and structural condition. Local cable force adjustments and precision surveying reduced the remaining mismatch, while the center gap stayed completely empty. Then the dedicated Guilluman closure segment, weighing about 473 tons, approached the final opening under controlled lifting. Temporary fixation began only after the segment reached both interfaces, while the lifting system still carried part of its weight. With the center structurally continuous, inspectors checked the new connections, geometry, and load path before transport systems were finished. The completed truss now revealed its purpose clearly. Highway traffic would run above, while two railway tracks ran below. On the upper level, crews installed waterproofing, pavement, drainage, barriers, and the remaining highway systems zone by zone. Below, the railway teams installed and aligned exactly two tracks inside the protected depth of the steel truss. Road and railway finishing advanced together, turning the structurally closed bridge into a functioning double-deck transport corridor. Engineers also inspected bearings and expansion joints, components that had to accommodate loads and long-term structural movement. Monitoring sensors, protected cabling, drainage, and corrosion protection were finalized before the bridge could face controlled testing. For the static load test, two heavy freight test trains entered the lower railway, one on each track. The trains were stopped at prescribed positions, so engineers could apply a known load to critical parts of the structure. With the test load held in place, survey instruments measured tiny structural movements that were almost invisible to the eye. Monitoring covered the main girder, towers, stay cables, and bearings, checking how the complete structural system responded together. Once the required measurements were complete, the test trains withdrew slowly, leaving the bridge ready for its final transition to service. What had once been open water now carried a 16.34-kilometer corridor across islands and multiple channels of the Pingtan Strait. On the upper level, 6 highway lanes carried road traffic across a structure built to survive the exposed marine environment. Beneath them, passenger trains crossed on 2 railway tracks running through the same deep structural truss. Three separated cable-stayed navigation bridges punctuate the route, while much longer approach structures carry most of the crossing. At opening, it was described as the world's longest cross-sea road rail bridge, built through years of marine precision and heavy construction.